so again, I had assigned you guys questions last week. Everybody had one question, but if you weren't here last week, obviously you wouldn't have known that you had a question. So you can see me at break if you need to figure out if you need to do anything about that. All right, so today we're talking about World War I, and we're going to go through the notes, but we're also, there's quite a few little clips of things I want to show you guys, so we're going to move to that as well. But so when we speak of World War I, does anybody know off the top of their head the date that World War I broke out?
19, you mean before the U.S. got into
Yeah.
it? 1914, wasn't it?
Yep.
It's right there.
Yep.
July 18th, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia.
All right, so the war starts in 1914. We had nothing to do with the war to begin with. It had to do with various European nations getting involved in this. But before we get to that, let's just talk a little bit about Wilson. Woodrow Wilson had been elected in 1912 originally. He definitely considered himself to be a domestic leader. He wasn't very in tune with foreign affairs, and even to the point, I think it might say up there, that he even said, "It would be an irony of fate if my administration had to deal chiefly with foreign affairs."
When he said that he would like to be a domestic leader, it's mean that he wants only to work in this country.
He saw himself as being more of an expert in what was going on within the country, not, that he didn't really feel like he knew very much about foreign affairs. So in his mind, as long as the country continued it as it had for several years before him, everything would be great. The problem was, one of the major things in his presidency happened to be a world war. So he did end up getting very involved in foreign affairs. The interesting thing to me is that he knew going in that he was not an expert in foreign affairs, and yet his arrogance in terms of how he chose to handle things once the war happened disturbs me. If he knew he wasn't an expert, then he should have been willing to look to other people that really did have that expertise. But instead, he tried to do things his way, and I think we'll talk about this as the class goes on, but he really ended up causing some serious problems for our country and for the world, not just for our country, but for the rest of the world as well. He did also continue interference in Latin America, which is what other presidents before him had done. We still saw ourselves as being the policemen of the Western Hemisphere. And so Mexico was one of those places, but also Nicaragua and the Dominican Republic. Again, a lot of this has to do with our version of what's the right form of government. And if other people are not adhering to that, we feel that we have to interfere. Well, I understand that, but if the people of that country are fine with that leadership, then who are we to say that they can't have that leadership? That's the part that bothers me, is that when the actual people are saying we're good with this, then why do we have the right to step in and take out that particular leader? And we've done that in more than one occasion. So this was another kind of situation that happened like that when this rebellion broke out under Pancho Villa, where Wilson decided, well, not just that, but one even before that, where Herta had seized power and Wilson decided he wasn't going to do that, or wasn't going to recognize him. But when this war did break out in Europe in 1914, the U.S., our government as well as the people of the U.S. wanted to remain neutral. We didn't want anything to do with it. We felt like it was way far away, had nothing to do with us. It shouldn't involve us. We should not end up having to send people there to get killed. In this time period, believe it or not, our country was much more of an isolationist. That was our philosophy, that we should not be drawn into these other world affairs. Now, obviously, when we chose to, if we felt that it was going to benefit us, that was one thing. But in terms of a war that broke out because of disagreements between two European nations, we did not feel that that should have anything to do with us. Obviously, that changed as time went on, but that was our initial position. And when Wilson ran for re-election in 1916, the war had been going on for, well, when he was running for re-election, it had been going on for at least a year, and then it was into the second year. And most of the American people supported him because his campaign platform was basically that he was going to keep us out of the war. So in 1916, he runs for re-election with the idea that he's going to make sure the U.S. does not get involved in this war. Obviously, that didn't happen. In 1917, we did end up declaring war. Now, I'm not saying that that's his fault. I think we really were pulled into it. But I'm saying that from the standpoint that this was what the American people wanted, at least initially, was to be able to stay out of this. To not have to send their husbands and sons overseas to fight in this war. Now, in terms of why the war happened, one of your questions, the first question was, how did the concept of balance of power contribute to the outbreak of World War I? So before getting into my notes, Matthew, Caleb, and Dakota had that question, right? So how would you respond to that? How did the concept of balance of power contribute to the outbreak of World War I? Dakota?
Europe made itself into two major alliances, the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entity, or Triple Allies, which basically divided the power in half until Italy switched sides. But it was due to those allies that everybody ended up involved in the war, because you had to back your allies in the war.
Okay. Caleb, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I said the formation of alliances resulted in the large-scale conflict of World War I.
Resulted in what?
The large-scale conflict
Okay.
of World War I.
And who else had this one? Matthew? Anything?
I pretty much what I said was along the same lines as where Austria-Hungary and Serbia started the war, but the Ottomans didn't seem it fair, so they joined in, and then Germans joined in, and then everyone just piled in.
Okay, so you're all correct in what you said, but in terms of relating that specifically to the concept of balanced power, you didn't really speak to that directly. Anybody?
Isn't it because they had signed agreements that if one country was attacked and then the other countries in the alliance had to, come to their aid? Is that part of what you're talking
Well,
about?
and they all kind of said that, but I guess my question is, why did they sign those agreements in the first place? What was the purpose of those agreements creating those different alliances?
I know, Germany and Russia were
Speak
having,
up.
Germany and Russia were having problems or something during, oh my god, but all those countries had issues with each other to begin with. And they were kind of like, I guess, ganging up on each other in a way, like doing it behind each other's backs, like, okay, we had, like, making connections before anything actually did start, and then, like, I guess, with all that tension being there to begin with, and, like, the different cultures that they had, it just, rumors were being spread of all of that, and
Okay.
somebody decided.
Basically, I was going to say, someone saying they already knew that they were going to go into war, so why not align themselves with other people?
But keep in mind that these alliances were before there ever was a war.
Were they like planning it? So they were like, all right, we're going to do this, so let's get ourselves buddy with these people.
Yes and no.
Didn't Russia make a lot of fake promises to,
You get her?
I just did that. I cracked it on that corner, and it looks like I tried to commit suicide.
Need a tissue? I got one.
It seems to be not flowing or anything. But what I'm getting at here is, let's put it this way. Let's say that you're a kid, a young kid, and, you're little, you know, kind of a wimpy kid, and there's another kid at school that always beats up on you, okay? Who has the balance of power?
The big kid.
The big kid, right, that's doing the beating up. So what do you do to try to equalize that balance of power?
Go get your big
somebody
brother.
else.
Yeah, you either get your big brother or some other kid that's big, and so between the two of you, you can at least balance the power with that other kid. Maybe deter him from doing anything because he knows he's not gonna just have to deal with you, the wimpy kid, but he's gonna have to deal with the big thug over here, right? That's basically what they attempted to do. There was a lot of tension in Europe, there had been for years and years, and they decided that, like, one country would say, well, if I get attacked, I'm gonna be in big trouble. So I better find me some thugs, some buddies to help me out in case I get attacked. But then once a couple of countries did that, then the other countries, realizing that they were doing that, were like, well, now if they gang up on us, we're gonna be in trouble. So we better find us some friends. So it became this kind of, you know, two sides, two big alliances that had formed around this idea that every time you get stronger, we have to get stronger. And then if we get stronger, you have to get stronger. And so they were doing it supposedly to keep war from happening, because they were trying to balance out the power and keep any one country or any one alliance from becoming too powerful. But in doing that, they almost set themselves up for war, because all it would take is one domino to drop, and everybody else jumps onto the pile. And that's exactly what happened. The fact that one person, and I'm not saying that that one person wasn't important, but the fact that one person could be assassinated, not by a country, but by some crazy dude, and that would lead to a world war that would last for more than 4 years and take millions of lives, is just absolutely ridiculous. It shouldn't have had to happen that way. But as soon as that one person was assassinated, then everybody starts, you know, posturing, figuring out whose side they're going to take, and the next thing you know, we're fighting a war over the death of one person.
Well, it probably wouldn't even happen if he wasn't killed where he was, because where he was already a disputed area.
Right. Which, you know, anybody can go back and say, well, maybe it wasn't smart for him to be there, this shouldn't have happened, but the fact that those world leaders let it get to this point,
It's almost like they used it as an excuse.
yeah, I would agree with that. I think sometimes that happens. All right, so anyway, let's talk a little bit more about that. So what happens here is that Europe has arranged itself into these two major alliances. At the time, the three major countries that are part of the Triple Alliance are Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary. I don't remember what's on your list of terms, but I just say typically I expect you to know which countries are in which alliance. Not all the little countries, but the major ones. So you should know that the Triple Alliance is Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary.
Yeah, the only one is Triple Alliance. The Triple Allies is on the list.
Okay. And the second one is referred to as the Triple Entente, or they're called the Allies, and that's Britain, France, and Russia. Now, eventually, Japan and Italy joined them, but in terms of the beginning stages of this, Germany, Italy, Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary is an empire at this point in time. That's not two separate countries. It's the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so don't think of that as two separate countries. It's one unity. So on June 28th, 1914, this Bosnian Serb, they call him a terrorist, so they were around back then too, it isn't just today, assassinated the Archduke of Austria as he toured the city of Sarajevo. Sarajevo was part of the Austria-Hungarian Empire. However, they didn't want to be. They had been taken over and they wanted to be independent. He's there kind of on a goodwill tour, going through the city, shaking hands, kissing babies, but this guy doesn't appreciate it because he doesn't think of them as being his government, his leaders. And so he kills Franz Ferdinand. Franz Ferdinand was with his wife, Sophia. She had, I think they had 4 children, and when she was pregnant, and they killed them both. So you can see how this, you know, plays out in the press. This poor, mother-to-be, already with 4 small children at home, is, killed by this crazy dude. So Sarajevo, capital of Bosnia, which was a province of Austria-Hungary, but Serbia felt that that area should be part of their country. They felt that it had been taken from them in the imperialistic stage. Russia tended to be friends with the Serbs, and so Russia felt the need to come to their aid, and then that led Germany to feel compelled to back Austria-Hungary because that's the side they were on, so they declare war on Russia and France, and then Great Britain declares war, and it just keeps going until by 1915 pretty much all of Europe is involved in this war. Let's look at a couple of maps if I can get these to come up without. So this shows the Allied powers in the lighter color. What does this look like to you? Green?
Yeah.
So that's your Central Powers, or the Triple Alliance. And then this color are the nations that did their best to stay neutral during this war, which was not an easy thing to do.
Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. I thought they were part of the one alliance.
Well, they were. Italy started out as part of this Triple Alliance. Relatively quickly, they switched sides. By 1915, they had switched sides. And so in this map, they're showing them as part of this group because they switched in 1915. But notice here, you see this red line, which is referred to as the Western Front, and then over here, this red line is the Eastern Front. So you've got the German Empire and Austria-Hungary kind of here in the middle, fighting on both fronts. Fighting Russia on the Eastern Front, and then fighting France and Great Britain on the Western Front. We're going to talk more about this in a little bit, but in 1917, Russia dropped out of the war, and they signed their own peace treaty with Germany. So when that happened in 1917, this war was no longer going on. Russia was now neutral, which allowed Germany to then refocus their attention over here. Luckily, I think, maybe not everybody would agree with me, but luckily, it took Russia so long to drop out. I mean, it had been 3 years, that by the time Germany was able to focus their attention over here, they didn't have the resources to knock France and Great Britain out quickly, and it wasn't, it was around the time that we got involved. If Russia had settled with Germany a year before, this whole thing could have been a completely different situation.
We would be speaking German.
Yeah, possibly. Because we weren't there, until we didn't join the war until April of 1917. So if this had happened in 1916, before we could get ourselves over there and get ourselves involved, they might very well have taken over Europe. Now, let me just mention something. Remember I mentioned last week the Battle of Gallipoli? We're going to show a little clip of that, but that's one of the famous battles of the war, and it's the one that I told you about that Mel Gibson was in when he was very young. So
Yeah.
I'm going to show you a clip of the movie with Mel Gibson in it in a little bit. Okay?
The Netherlands and Switzerland are they're stuck. I don't know how they managed to attempt to stay neutral.
Yeah. And, I don't know enough about this war to comment on that, other than to say that usually countries that stay neutral are not totally neutral, that there's usually something that at least one side really needs from that country that allows them to kind of protect them and to keep them from becoming a major war zone. So I would assume that there was something involved like that, because, you know, how do you just, armies marching back and forth across your country, it's not exactly like you can really totally be neutral, you know? Henry?
Japan was part of that, part of the Britain and France group, weren't they?
Yes.
It's so funny how a few years later they go, it's just wild how history is.
Well, and, you know, it just shows that people are gonna do in that moment what they think is best for them at that time. It's not necessarily about loyalty and respect for any given group of people.
It's funny because the minute Japan joined the war, it was officially a world war at that point.
That's true. I should have shown you this first. This is actually just showing the map of different things in Latin America where the U.S. got involved in some form or another by like sending troops and things like that. So you have in Cuba the different times that troops were there, Nicaragua, Haiti. I mean, obviously Puerto Rico became one of our territories. Dominican Republic, the Virgin Islands. I mean, it just shows all the different areas that we chose to get involved and were able to justify doing so. Which, you know, don't get me wrong. I mean, I do think that we have to be more careful when it comes to Latin America because they are right in our hemisphere and could be an easy place for some country to launch an attack from. So I understand why we have to be somewhat protective here. But I do think that there were times we got involved and we justified doing so when we really didn't have any right to be there. They could have worked out their problems on their own. It wasn't up to us to settle those. All right, so as I said before, the U.S. attempted to stay neutral.
Didn't work.
So as the great European nations went to war, U.S. declared its neutrality, its right to continue to trade with all countries. So that's another funny thing is it's like we want to be neutral, but we also want to sell stuff to any country that might be involved in the war. Well, that's a tough thing too, because if you're selling like guns and ammunition and stuff like that to both countries or to both sides, I don't know how you don't somehow pick a side. I mean, I don't know. How many of you can watch a football game and not end up picking a side when you're watching it, even if you have no interest in the two teams? I always end up picking a side.
Yeah, me too.
And I'm like cheering away for somebody, and it's like, I have no idea who you are. I have no connection with you, but I'm cheering you like as if, you know, you're all my brothers or something. So, you know, it's tough when you do that. And of course, our connection has to be more with Great Britain at this point in time because that's where we're from. We speak English, they speak English, you know. So as time went on, we did end up kind of leaning toward the British.
And France, because of the help
Well,
they gave us during the revolution.
Exactly. And it ended up showing in a couple of ways because our trade with Britain, we loaned money to them between 1914 and 1917. We loaned $2.5 billion to the Allies and only $27 million to Germany. Our trade with Britain rose at least 300%. I think your book might even say 400%. And with Germany, it fell to almost zero. But a lot of that had to do with the blockade that Great Britain was able to put up. I mean, it wasn't that we just refused to trade with Germany, but we couldn't get past Britain's blockade. And we didn't protest that much because we were selling so much to Britain, you know, the manufacturers here didn't really care because at least somebody's buying their products. So, if we look at this map, so Great Britain, the blue lined area shows some of the British military area So in order to ship stuff to Germany, you pretty much had to come in between, into this area. And Britain was able to keep that pretty well blockaded so that goods were not able to get there. In response to that, the Germans started using submarines. Now, submarines were relatively new at this point in time. I mean, there were one or two made during the Civil War, which it reminds me kind of what do they call those when those little kids build little cars and they race them?
Yeah, go,
What?
Matchbox.
No.
go-karts,
The
soapbox.
soapbox. Those soapbox derbies where the kids make the little, wooden cars and they, start them and they roll about 2 miles an hour, Well, that's kind of what the submarines of the Civil War were like. I mean, they weren't worth anything in terms of fighting because they hadn't perfected anything yet. But the Germans had really started to perfect submarines that were actually capable of taking out other ships. And they began using them pretty extensively. The problem with submarines, though, is if you attack a ship and you sink it, and you're in a submarine, there's not the ability for you to come to the aid of the survivors and take them on board your ship and make sure that they're treated as prisoners of war and treated respectfully, especially if you take out a ship that happens to have civilians on it.
Because they're just dead now.
Exactly. So this was considered very inhumane because they didn't always know what the ship that they were taking out was. They just knew it was in the area that they had declared to be a military zone. And if it happened to just be a shipping vessel or a fishing vessel or something like that, they were killing civilians. So there was a lot of outrage at what Germany was doing, but not necessarily what Great Britain was doing because Britain wasn't using submarines like the Germans were. And of course, since they speak German, they didn't call it a submarine. They called it an Untersee, I don't remember how to pronounce this part, but something like that. So, undersea boat. So, you'll see that in the book. If you have read that, you'll see that language there.
Bolton.
Bolton?
Luton.
So, one of the incidents that really did cause some outrage across the world was the sinking of the Lusitania. On May 7th, 1915, a British passenger liner, and I will tell you that at least one of you on the test will call this an American ship. I don't know who, but at least one of you is going to call this an American ship. Okay, it is not an American ship. It is a British passenger liner. It is not a British war vessel. It is a passenger liner. It's like the Titanic. Okay? But the Germans sunk it off of the coast of Ireland. Almost 1,200 people died on that ship. 128 of them were Americans. That's why people want to call it an American ship. But it just happened to be 128 Americans that were on that ship going overseas from America to the United Kingdom. Now, the reason why I believe Germany had every right to take out that ship is the British had put millions of rounds of ammunition on it for the war effort. Now, if you're stupid enough as a passenger to get on a boat that's carrying millions of rounds of ammunition into an area where Germans have submarines, then maybe you deserve to die.
Basically asking to die.
You're right.
They're asking to die. That's what they're doing.
I mean, and they were warned. Don't get, it's not like they weren't told. They were told that, you're doing this at your own risk, and they still chose to do it. Okay.
What, did they get like a discount or something?
Maybe they should have, right?
Well,
Hey,
and
if you
then-
guys go in here and make it seem like it's only for civilians, you guys are just there.
I mean, I understand why people would be outraged that all these civilians died and everything else, but you really shouldn't, it's not very smart to take that kind of chance in the middle of a war.
And then the British actually caused that to happen by putting their
Right.
ammunition on it.
Right. They were really
They
trying
were
to
at-
use
They were at fault as well.
they were using the people as a human shield. They
Exactly.
felt like Germany would not attack the ship if it were a passenger liner, so they were obviously willing to put all of these people So Germany, you know, argued that it was a legitimate target. I have to agree with them. But because they were afraid the U.S. would then enter the war because 128 Americans had died, they made a pretty, you know, expansive apology to the U.S., offered money, which, you know, doesn't bring back lives, but offered quite a bit of money to the families. And so the U.S. continued to remain neutral. They did not enter the war, whereas some people might have thought this was the point where we should have gotten involved, but we continued to be neutral. In 1916, and I don't think your book goes into this one, but another French ship called the Sussex was taken out, again by a German submarine. Only 2 Americans died on that particular boat, but the reason why I think it's important is because after that incident, Germany made a pledge called the Sussex Pledge, basically saying that there would be no more submarine attacks without advance warning and without having some kind of provision for the safety of survivors. So because of that pledge, we still felt like we could stay out of the war because it did seem that Germany was trying to back off and protect at least U.S. citizens that were traveling. So the Sussex Pledge to me is pretty important in the sense that Wilson took Germany at their word that they would not continue to just attack ships without some kind of warning and provision to try to save the survivors.
Of course, that didn't happen.
Well, for a while it did. They did change their position, but for a while it did seem that they were honoring that. So in the latter part of 1916, Wilson is running for re-election. He's running on that concept of, you know, I've kept the U.S. out of war, and I'm going to continue to do so, hopefully. And he even, I don't know that I fully understand that quote of Wilson, where he said, there's such a thing as a man being too proud to fight. I mean, I know what he's saying, kind of, but in this particular scenario, I don't know that it really fit the circumstances. I mean, yes, there's times where somebody's bullying you or just hassling you and, you know, there just isn't any need to engage them because they're just making a fool of themselves. I understand that, but sometimes it's just like, you know, why should I bother, you know? I have more dignity than to lower myself to your level, but not, this is a whole different kind of situation here. Anyway, he ran against Charles Evan Hughes, who was a Supreme Court justice. Pretty narrow election, so obviously Wilson didn't have, you know, full support of the country. It's not like he was overwhelmingly re-elected. Remember his Secretary of State, I had mentioned this before, was William Jennings Bryan. Bryan was a pacifist, and we're in the, you know, the world is in the middle of a war, and it looks like we're going to get drawn into it. So he resigns, and the Secretary of State becomes Robert Lansing, who was not a pacifist and did support us getting into the war if necessary. I mean, if circumstances warranted it, he felt that we needed to do that. All right, so one of the questions on your midterm study guide has to do with what brought the U.S. into the war. It's not about how the war started in Europe, it's why did we get involved in it. And I'm asking you to talk about events of 1915, 1916, and 1917. Well, what have we talked about in 1915 that could have been, could have led us into the war but didn't?
The Lusitania
Right,
sinking.
so in 1915, we had this pretty major event of the sinking of the Lusitania. Okay, what happened in 1916 that we just talked about? Last thing we forget. The Sussex
Oh,
and the Sussex Pledge. And then what we're going to talk about now is 1917, and there's really two kind of major things in 1917. In January of 1917, Germany announces that they're going to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. So they had pledged not to do that, but in January 1917, they felt like they couldn't help but do it. You know, they were going to lose if they didn't resume submarine warfare. So they make this announcement. And so obviously now all American ships have to really be on guard, because there's not going to be any warnings or anything like that. Okay, then the second thing, well, I should say there's three things in 1917. The second thing is this thing called the Zimmerman Note. The Zimmerman Note was a document that was intercepted, and this is what it said. This is the German minister to Mexico, and it's called the Zimmerman Note because his name was Arthur Zimmerman. So he's sending this to Mexico, to the government of Mexico. And he says, on the 1st of February, we intend to begin submarine warfare unrestricted. That's what they had announced in January, but now they're telling the people of Mexico this is what we're going to do starting February 1st. In spite of this, it is our intention to endeavor to keep neutral the United States of America. So they're still hoping that the U.S. will stay neutral, even though they're going to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. However, if this attempt is not successful, we propose an alliance on the following basis with Mexico: that we shall make war together and together make peace. We shall give general financial support, and it is understood that Mexico is to reconquer the lost territory in New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona. The details are left to you for settlement. You are instructed to inform the President of Mexico of the above in the greatest confidence as soon as it is certain that there will be an outbreak of war with the United States, and suggest that the President of Mexico, on his own initiative, should communicate with Japan, suggesting adherence at once to this plan. At the same time, offer to mediate between Germany and Japan. Please, and this is kind of a bluff here, please call to the attention of the President of Mexico that the employment of ruthless submarine warfare now promises to compel England to make peace in a few months. He's basically, trying to say, hey, we pretty much have England beat, so, don't worry, we're going to win. Therefore, you're not going to be in any trouble over there. So what's he offering to Mexico?
United States, Texas, Arizona.
Why? Why that particular territory?
Because that was the war that we were with Mexico, and we took that
It's a
from
touchy
them.
subject.
Yeah, the Mexican War took place from 1846 to 1848, and we took all of that land from them. So what this guy is saying is, hey, if you help us fight the U.S., we'll make sure you get that land back. Yes?
Is that a real, okay, when I read that in the book, there's a, conspiracy theory, could that just been something that Britain might have made up to, edge the United States to
Yeah.
come help us, we need your help?
There's definitely people that believe that this is not a legitimate telegram, that it was actually concocted by Great Britain, and that Britain said that, because they were the ones who found it, supposedly, not us. So Britain says that they intercepted this, and they show it to the U.S. Obviously, if this is true, it's going to really anger the United States that Germany is plotting to get Mexico to go to war against us. So some people have said that Britain made this up because they wanted the U.S. to join the war on their side. And that if they had something like this and they believed it to be true, then they would feel that they had to kind of preempt that and get involved in the war. I think, although there are some, good historians that believe that it was concocted by Great Britain, I think the majority of historians do believe it was an actual telegram that was intercepted. And I can't say that I've done enough research on it to have my own valid opinion. But whether or not it was real or not real, Wilson took it as being real, and it was very much this that was at least one of the final straws leading us to get involved in the war. So the Zimmerman note, or the Zimmerman telegram, you know, you'll hear it referred to, is another 1917 event. And then the final straw was the fact that Germany did begin submarine warfare again. And in March of 1917, 5 of our American ships were taken out, and 66 Americans on those 5 ships were killed. And so Wilson went to Congress, asked for a declaration of war, and Congress voted for that declaration of war on April 6th. There were still 50 congressmen, and to be honest, I don't know, unless somebody wants to Google it real quickly, I don't know how many people were in Congress at this time. I don't think we weren't at our maximum yet, so I don't know in 1917 how many we had, but 50 out of probably about 400 would be my guess. That's still a pretty significant number after everything we've just had happen, you know? To have 50 of them plus 5 senators vote to not enter the war. They still want to stay out of this war. Jeannette Rankin was the first woman ever elected to Congress. She voted against the war. She was a pacifist herself. The reason why I put that there is it's interesting to me that she also she was still in Congress when World War II broke out. And when we were attacked by Japan, she was the only person in Congress to vote not to enter World War II. The only person. It was unanimous except for Jeannette Rankin. And again, it was because she doesn't believe in war, period. I mean, she was a pacifist, and she just did not think it was right to ever engage in war. But she was there for both of those wars. Yes?
There was 435 representatives, 2 delegates, and 3 resident commissioners, according to this.
In 1917?
1970 and 1919, the 65th Congress. 435
Oh,
votes.
you know what I'm thinking of? I think it was 1929 that they set the number of Congress at 435. I mean, that they said it would never go above, or I shouldn't say never, but unless there's an amendment to the Constitution, it would stay at 435. So I guess it was already at 435, but it was just in 1929 that they kind of set that in stone. Okay, so there already were 435. Okay, that's good to know. But still, 55 people still were not comfortable with declaring war. You know, so obviously this was not where the whole country was gung-ho, let's, you know, go do whatever we need to do here. All right, so as the war gets started, I mean, for us anyway, just because we declared war in April doesn't mean that we were over there fighting the next week. It took us quite a while to get our armed forces together. We obviously called for volunteers. They actually had a draft. On May 18th, 1917, Wilson signed the Selective Service Act. So all males between ages 21 and 30 had to register. We ended up creating a 488,000-man army with about the same number in a backup National Guard, and a conscription, meaning we could draft a total of 500,000 men. But as you can see, people, I mean, in 2 months, 9 million had registered for the draft. 2.8 million were inducted into the service, but 2 million volunteered. So, I mean, there were definitely enough people out there that felt strongly enough about this to be willing to volunteer to go fight overseas. Hopefully, I mean, the idea was to protect their own country, but I think they also were coming to the aid of the people in Europe. So of the 4.8 million total that ended up in the service, about half of them actually went overseas and were involved in the war. 367,000 black soldiers participated. Keep in mind that the black people in this country were still treated horribly. No respect, especially in the South. Definitely didn't get to exercise their civil rights, to vote, or pretty much anything else. Lots of lynchings across the country continued at this time. And these men are willing to volunteer and go overseas and fight for their country.
That just blows my mind, cause like they're, over here, what do they have to fight for? Nobody likes them,
Right.
Why try to help us out?
Yeah.
Do you think some of them did that to escape slavery?
Well, not slavery, because slavery had ended, but to escape prejudice, discrimination, everything else that they were faced with. Yes, and I think, probably they thought that if they could go over there and show themselves to be men, just like,
To gain some
the white
respect.
guys, they would gain some respect. The people would start to see them as human beings that were capable of, being leaders in their country. So it was hard for them, though. Your book talks about this too, because over there they were shown respect. The French, in particular, seemed to treat them quite well, and let them fight with them and everything else. So over there they were treated like men, and then they came back and kind of went back to being treated like crap over here. So it didn't really change a lot, especially in the South. It was better in the North, but if you still lived in the South, not much had changed for them. I find it interesting that even in this time period, 30% of those that were drafted were rejected on physical grounds. That they just they weren't in good enough shape to be considered able to fight. And so that kind of started our whole public health and physical education movement in this country, because, we looked at our people and we're like, geez, we need to do something about this. The area where we really made our first impact was on the seas, but mostly because we started putting out these anti-submarine mines that, I don't know anything about this stuff, but I guess they explode, and
As soon as you get them, like, if you make contact with it, it explodes.
which then explodes the submarine,
It's like a
right?
grenade underwater.
Yeah.
And it's a chain reaction, cause there's a bunch of them throughout the water too.
And the
Crushes you
percussion
with
causes
pressure.
it.
I think I have a map that's,
Was it World War I or World War II, they started using drop charges
I don't know,
too?
when it comes to the weaponry, I'm not very knowledgeable. All right, first of all, let me show you the legend here. Those are the Allied minefields, and those are the Central Powers minefields. And this shows where a major battle took place. But in this area of primary U-boat, or the submarine activity, so look for those lines too. But look at all of these mines all throughout this. I mean, whether it's the Central Powers, the Allied, they're everywhere. That would be scary, don't you think? I don't know enough about this to know. I mean, that's a great big sea, so I don't know if it's, how many are actually there, but, to be traveling in any of those waters, you could definitely be coming close to, some of those mines. But that's where America was able to start to make a difference and really start to take out some of those German submarines and, begin to gain back control of those waters that allowed them access as far as trading to the Allies and stuff like that. And if you see here, the area of the primary U-boat activity there, but then they have it in here too. I could see them trying to do it here in the channel, but what does this mean?
I think that's a thinner red line and it's not associated with the other one.
It's like a blockade,
Is it?
There's a bigger picture up in the corner, I think it's just a magnification.
Oh, I see what you're saying, yeah.
That's
Okay, so
pretty
that's
good.
just referring to that. Okay, that makes more sense. I was like, that's not not even water, how can it be where they had lines? So this is just showing the Western Front and where several of the major battles took place. As you can see from these dates, these are all 1918 here, except for this one's 1916, but all of these are 1918, which is when the Americans got involved, and it was, a lot of that is where the Americans did most of their fighting. And it's because of their victories and being able to push Germany back that the armistice was finally signed in November of 1918. All right, so by the time the U.S. had entered the war, it had already degenerated into a stalemate of what's called trench warfare. Trenches were usually only separated by a few hundred yards. But think about a football field, and you've got maybe 300, 400, 500 yards between your line and the enemy's line.
Wow.
All right? That distance in between is called no man's land. Why? Because no man wants to be in there, right? Because you're probably going to die. And typically, when you decided to go on the offensive, your commander would blow a whistle and you would be ordered over the top, which meant climb out of the trench and start running toward the other guy's trench and hope that you get there before they shoot you.
And then just once you're in there, you
It didn't work very often. And if you did get there, it's not like they shook their hand and said, wow, congratulations, you made it across this whole way and you didn't get, shot. Now I'm going to have to take my bayonet and stab you. It wasn't, even if you made it across, the chance of you then surviving was pretty slim. So most of them were mowed down like sitting ducks. Others got tangled up in the barbed wire, because what you would do is you would set up these, like, not barbed wire necessarily like a fence, but like these big rolls of barbed wire that were just all across the front. And you'd get over there, but then you have to get past the barbed wire, which often meant, cutting yourself up, trying to climb over it or get past it in some form or another, which obviously slowed you down and distracted you, which gave the other guys more time to be able to pick you off. And then in 1915, Germany started using poison gas, and that really became a horrendous part of this war. Just for an example, the Battle of Somme in 1916, 3 days. 3 days. The British lost 600,000 and the Germans lost 500,000. That's 1,100,000 people either dead or wounded in 3 days.
This just shows how stupid people are to continue with us.
Now once the Americans got there, the Americans felt like they had good troops, good commanders, and they wanted to stay in charge of their own people. The French had been fighting this war for 3 years. They wanted the Americans to join their troops and be commanded by their commanders. And the Americans said, no, we're not going to do that. So basically, until we get over there in 1917, we don't even start the fight until March of 1918. Our men basically toured Paris and celebrated and had fun and shacked up with a bunch of prostitutes while the fighting went on, because we would not be willing to let them serve under French commanders.
I think it was something in the book that during 1917 is when the African Americans got into the war, because they were like, yeah, we don't care, we'll
Right.
work under anybody.
Yeah, that's right. They were willing to let the African Americans fight with the French because they didn't really care, but they weren't going to let their white soldiers be under the command of the French commanders. So, but in March of 1918, the Germans launched a major offensive, and it was at that point that the French agreed to let the American commanders command their own troops and not have to be subject to them, because now the French were pretty desperate. So, June 1918, American forces helped to repel a German offensive at Chateau Thierry. I don't know how to pronounce this stuff. then into the forest of Blue Wood. As they marched into this, the French were retreating because they had seen such heavy fighting and they were not doing well. And the French are retreating as the Americans are advancing, and they're telling the Americans, the war is over. Don't keep going, it's done. And they basically told them to turn back and retreat. And supposedly, the response by one American was something to the effect of, retreat, hell, we just got here.
Seems pretty, legitimate.
Yeah. So, the Americans continued to fight, and, we're talking just from June, July, August, September, and then we really start to see the pushback in the Argonne Forest. And finally, Germany realized that, they were done. And so they agreed to an armistice or a ceasefire on November 11th, 1918. Why is that date significant?
Veterans Day, Armistice Day.
Yep. Forgot to put that down there. The reason why we celebrate Veterans Day, today we call it Veterans Day, and we just celebrate all veterans of all wars. But originally it was called Armistice Day, and it celebrated the end of World War I. So November 11th is the holiday where we're really celebrating the end of World War I, but we've kind of just made it a celebration of all veterans. But look at the numbers here. 2 million Americans were in Europe. About 1.3 million of them saw combat. We lost 112,000 men dead, 230,000 wounded. And we were only there a year. We fought less than that. We fought like 6 months. But look what the Germans lost. 2.2 million. The Russians, 1.9 million. The French, 1.4 million. And the British, 900,000. Horrendous casualties. And this is referred to as the Great War because nobody had ever seen a war like this before. Because the technology was huge. Improved machine guns, high-powered artillery, poison gas, all of those things really changed the nature of war for the first time. We actually had tanks too, not nearly as important in this war as they're going to be in World War II. Airplanes, but again, just the beginning of airplanes, so not anything like what it's going to be in World War II. But still, all of this technology is going to lead to many, many more casualties. And as I talked about the barbed wire, one author said the war really lasted 100 years. 4 years to fight, 96 years to roll up all the barbed wire and clear it off the fields.
Yeah, 100 years.
1 in every 10 American soldiers contracted venereal disease in Europe. 10%.
No comment.
Women, for the first time, actually served, but generally speaking, not in combat. 10,000 of them were in the Navy, hundreds in the Marines, many more were in auxiliary roles. Obviously, many of them served as nurses. I don't know if that's right, based on what we read before, but anyway. So this is the United States involved on the Western Front in 1918. So this shows you some of the places we talked about just a second ago. And when Germany tried to launch their major offensive, the line were pushed back. The Americans and the French were pushed back, but luckily they were able to regroup and then push the Germans back. And, they continued to push them back point, you know, that they were able, you know, to get the Germans to agree that they needed to end this and to sign the treaty. So this line shows where the Germans had been pushed back to at the time that they were willing to sign the armistice. Now here, where it says stabilized front 1914 to 1917, you see the line, the dotted line? It's kind of showing you that things got stuck there, to where nobody was making major advances. Sometimes you would take a trench and gain, you know, 300, 400, 500 yards, but not get any farther than that. And then they might have an offensive and push you back, you know, and then it was kind of this back and forth thing. But nobody was really able to kind of break through and actually conquer the other. So, you know, think about being the soldier that's out there in the trenches, and you're there for weeks or months or even years, and nothing really happens. You have to begin to question, what are we doing? What is the purpose of all of this? What are we really fighting for? You know, we're stuck out here in this trench, and I'm going to show you a video that talks about what the conditions were like, but it really didn't make sense to the average soldier that's out there being asked to do this fighting. Show you this real quick. This is the kind of propaganda that was common during World War I.
It's supposed to represent Germany, and then the lady's supposed to represent America, correct?
What?
The gorilla or monkey or whatever is Germany, and then the lady's supposed to represent America and
Right.
freedom.
Yeah.
That it's
So-
taken away, I think.
This is, you know, this ape, this evil-looking ape is representing Germany, and he's holding a stick that says culture, Kultur. And this says, if this war is not fought to a finish in Europe, it will be on the soil of the United States. But the Germans were referred to as Huns, because it goes back to the Roman Empire days when the Huns would attack the Roman Empire and try to destroy it, and Attila the Hun and all of that kind of stuff. So the Germans are considered to be the descendants of the Huns. And the Germans at this time, they really did wear these helmets or whatever that had these sharp, I don't know what they're called, but these sharp points on them, and then if you got into hand-to-hand combat, you could duck your head and actually drive it into somebody and kill them, kind of like a bayonet. My son was in grade school, and his principal at that school was had been a history major, so he really loved history. And my son was 3rd grade, 4th grade, something like that age. And I was preparing a lecture about World War I, and I was looking at a book that had a lot of the propaganda in it, like this, and probably this very picture. And my son happened to come up and was talking to me, and he sees the pictures, because he's a very visual person, and he's like looking at the pictures, and he's asking me about it. So I'm trying to explain to him what this is representing, and, you know, how the Germans were called Huns, and they were considered to be evil, and that we had to protect the United States from them and everything. And he's like, oh, you know, that's cool. And apparently he goes to school the next day, and he's sitting at the lunch table, and there was always one teacher or one administrator at the lunch table. And this happened to be the principal that day. And so the principal's sitting there, and my son takes out his lunch, because we always packed his lunch, and he takes out his lunch, and he has an apple and those peanut butter crackers that you can open and take the peanut butter out of them, and carrots, little baby carrots. And he proceeds to take the carrot and shove it into the top of the apple, and then take the peanut butter and create a face on it with fangs, like this. And the principal sees him playing with his food, and he says, Daniel, what are you doing? And he says, said, "This is an evil German Hun."
Wow.
And I got a phone call that day. Because the teacher wanted to know what we had against Germans.
Was the teacher like?
I mean, the principal wanted to know what we had against Germans. And I had to explain to him
Give a lecture to him.
that we don't have anything against
Didn't
Germans.
come from like a German
Just,
descent.
I teach history, and then I realized the principal was also a history teacher, and he said, "Oh, that makes so much more sense." There was another time that, you know how they teach kids about warning signs of alcohol and drug abuse and everything, and they're really little?
Yeah.
Daniel was in the 2nd grade and got a phone call from his teacher wanting to tell us about how Daniel proceeded to tell the whole class when they were discussing alcohol and what it can do, how his mommy would be sitting watching TV after the kids went to bed, and if he came downstairs, that his mommy would jump up and start screaming at him and chasing him back up the steps because she was drinking her alcohol and didn't want him to disturb her. And
Oh my God.
she just felt that she needed to talk to me about that. I was like, first of all, back in that day, I don't even think I was drinking any alcohol, so I don't know what he thought I was drinking. And if I'm yelling at you and chasing you back upstairs, it's just because you're a brat. It's not because I'm drinking.
Oh, he was out of bed.
Anyway, let's
No, it's still more. No,
let's take a look at.
no, finish it.
You finish
No,
it.
melt it.
Actually,
Okay, one more.
why don't we take a break
Done.
and then we'll come back at 7:25-ish.
Uh-oh.
That's already?
Okay. I haven't actually done it yet, but I know you said we'll do it here in a second. Thanks.
Just answer all these, right?
You write a little blurb or whatever you think she wants to know about it. And if you're not sure what she wants to, you can know about something like that.
And then he said,
The 4 essay prompts.
and then are those the ones that I'm gonna be, or just one of the four?
She picks 3. No. You have to answer 2, but she usually puts 3 on the exam. She puts 3 on the exam and then you pick 2.
Wait, I have a question.
So of these 4, she'll pick 3 to put on the exam.
It's
From
on the
those
other
3, you have
side.
to
It's, I brought out my notebooks.
So basically, yeah.
Okay, that's fine. Thanks.
Cool, yeah,
And
thank you.
she's actually, when we were here, I clicked on this. If you click on that one, it opens it up in Word.
Oh,
And then from there you go to new editing and you can print it
you're awesome.
or save it or whatever you wanna do.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey,
Yeah, and never go to files for anything,
Right.
do multiple, cause
if
files
you,
is
if you
the
go
one
under
long.
assignments,
Right,
It'll do everything.
you'll see the chapter 22 assignment.
okay.
All the
Will you
math,
just
all the
pick
extra
a
stuff.
question
And that's modules, right?
and respond to it
Alright.
and then bring it
Thank
in
you.
next week?
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
We'll figure something out. I'm just gonna give this to you now because I have to leave soon.
Okay.
It's the homework. She knows. She knows. She told me to remind you that I'm gonna be gone. I'm like, she knows. She's got this.
Are you gonna be gone 2 weeks?
Yeah. And I'll have all the medical notes and stuff.
And you're gonna
wanted to let you know how high on pain meds I am. Do you have the date for the midterm? The midterm for this class is tonight. Because I'm not entirely sure how dopey my pain meds are going to give me. I'm sorry. I was on pain medication once for kidney stone, and I called her at like midnight, and I wanted to discuss monkeys, and I believe they were purple. And she hasn't lived to live it down. And that was like 3 years ago. So now she's like, do not call me. I'm sorry.
Unless if you're dying, then you can call.
Yeah. I think that was the face go down.
What, more?
Just getting the video ready.
Should we just leave now? I'm not leaving right at 3 o'clock. Just keep them in his email back to me. Yeah. At least one of us has a ring.
That way I don't steal it.
I don't know these. You took the pen. You're not in pen. The rest of that, one of us has a ring all the time, because between us, if we have the other, we wouldn't have a ring all the time. It wasn't an easy thought. He heard half the things that we said to each other.
I'm pretty good. I'm sorry, there's 4 pages that I have to say.
Why do you have four?
Because that's how it turned out, 4 pages.
I'm sorry, I wrote more than I usually do. I'm just gonna leave now, that way I'm not leaving right as break's over.
Don't leave yet.
Don't leave yet?
I want you to hear this one thing.
Okay,
It's like 3 minutes long.
okay.
Is that okay?
As long as I'm out of here by like 7:30.
Oh, excuse me. Excuse me.
Well, she asked me to wait, and then she asked, so I
Wow,
have to give her
oh
the
my
answer.
goodness.
Jesus, Emily. Dr. Dunn and I, we've had much weirder conversations. It's okay.
I could see, you know, like, oh, costly, excuse me.
Oh my goodness.
Thank you for helping me out, sis, I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
I sure hope none of you are looking at porn out there.
No, no.
I had that happen.
What?
In my court,
What?
What?
All of our semester.
a student in the class that sat like right where you're sitting. And
Oh, no.
How'd you find out about it?
well, you know, I don't usually go walking around the room and stuff, but he was a little different. Anyway, but I finally had a student who sat like, I can't remember if it was over there or over there, they could see what he was doing. And they came up and said, you know, Dr. Dunn, I didn't want to say anything, but this has been going on for several weeks.
In class? Why?
I don't even know, I would have thought that they wouldn't be able to get it on their computer because of like, you know,
I don't
unless he
know.
had it saved on his computer and was just calling up files.
I
or
don't know
something.
if the Wi-Fi is censored.
I don't think it is.
I think it's only
Well,
censored
only
if you're on.
certain browsers.
Are censored?
Yeah.
Leave it till the kind
They
of the
just
corner.
updated last semester, so I don't know if they.
But that was like, you know, what do you do? I didn't really wanna go back and look over his shoulder. I didn't wanna see what everybody was looking at.
Wow.
To circumvent the school censorship if there is any. It's
It usually,
No,
You can-
only certain browsers where it's like there's a virus detected, 'cause like as soon as you hit it, it won't allow you to go through. But other than that,
But you can download an app which is a secret browser that doesn't connect, so they won't be able to see it at all.
No, you just get something called a VPN, and it's.
Wow.
You run it,
Tell me I'm not gonna go there.
You know way too much over there.
cause I know like, on school computers, like if you use the computers here, if you even like click on Wikipedia, like a certain page on Wikipedia, it'll shut you out of the internet. It's like, nope, you're banned. Come back tomorrow.
Hmm.
Cause apparently it's not a safe site through the school or whatever.
Years ago, I know there was a guy that actually worked in the tech support part. He was a student, and he had like a work-study job. You know, and he was the one that would go around to like, you know, fix something on a class computer and stuff like that. And apparently, he would sit in the office, you know, where he would like waited for calls. He was downloading all this porn and everything. When they finally caught him, he got fired.
Oh, no.
So, Dr. Dunn,
Yes.
the midterm will be all the way up to the Great Depression, correct?
Yeah, through chapter 24.
Okay, I'm just trying to organize my notes, so I know what to study.
I had a teacher in high school, kids would text, and she'd be like, okay, either you have your phone out, or you're getting expelled, which is it? And the amount of people who didn't want their phone taken away, so they're just like, not saying it, or they tuck their phone into their pants, so it's like, okay, what were you actually doing? Because you just pulled your phone out of a weird place.
Yeah.
I remember like when you had the button phones, you just be like, I just have your phone inside, just.
Yes, everybody knew how to
You just
text
memorize
without
what numbers,
looking
what
when
letters
phones
it is,
had
like-
buttons.
T9?
Yeah.
Oh my god.
Yes, because the five had a phone. So if you could find the five and you knew your phone, you could go into your contacts, pick the person, send a text. The only
Without
thing you
even
have to
looking
look
at your
is to
phone,
reply.
you're just like,
That was all the way through middle school. The only time you had to look was to reply. You'd be like, what's
Yeah, the
it?
teacher
Okay.
would look you dead in your eye and was like, okay, what's up? My answer. And if you had a pocket in your side, just would.
Okay, that one
That
might
looks
be
a little weird.
The one thing I miss about phone buttons, now you have to like be careful when you tap.
Is this me or do you type, did you text faster with phone buttons on touchscreen and stuff?
I think
Because you memorized
most
it.
people texted faster with the buttons because it was just muscle memory at that point. That's like with the swipe to text though.
Oh, that's
Swipe.
hard, I can't do that.
Sometimes I like it, sometimes I hate it.
I mean, I can type on my iPhone without looking at it.
Yeah, I
I mean,
can,
I make
but I have to
typos.
look because sometimes like
You guys
the
got
learn
mad
words.
skills.
Yeah, I mean, if you just saw it, it's like, okay.
Yeah.
This isn't a new symbol, and I don't know.
No, I cannot type on a phone like this. It has to be upright. I cannot type
Yeah,
on
but
things sideways. Because my
Oh, I
hands
can't either.
my phone is
Not
so
like
big
that.
and my hands are so little. It doesn't work.
Choose the background also.
It doesn't.
I was gonna
Like,
say.
I don't want bright white.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and start this. Let me just say that I know you're gonna hate me for the next week because of what I'm about to play, and that's okay.
This is what you want us to
It's
Why?
done.
We can't get it out of our head.
Because this
that
is
why?
gonna stick in your head for the next week.
on the run. Hear them calling you and me, every son of liberty. Hurry right away, no delay, go today. Make your daddy glad to have had such a lad. Tell your sweetheart not to mind, to be proud her boys in line. Over there, send the word over there. That the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming, the drum coming everywhere. So prepare, say a prayer, send the word to beware. We'll be over, we're coming over, and we won't come back till it's over there, over there, over there. Send the word over there. That the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming, the drum coming everywhere. So prepare, say a prayer, send the word to beware. We'll be over, we're coming over, and we won't come back till it's over there. Johnny, get your gun, get your gun, get your gun. Johnny, show the Hun you're a son of a gun. Hoist the flag and let her fly. Yankee Doodle do or die. Pack your little kid, show your grit, do your bit. Yankee to the ranks from the towns and the tanks. Make your mother proud of you and the old red, white, and blue. Over there, send the word over there. That the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming, the drum coming everywhere. So prepare, say a prayer, send the word to beware. We'll be over, we're coming over, and we won't come back till it's over there. Over there, send the word over there. That the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming, the drum coming everywhere. So prepare, say a prayer, send the word to beware. We'll be over, we're coming over, and we won't come back till it's over there.
That was great.
What just
That was awesome.
Why did the book concentrated on that one person, George Brown, or was just a generic person that they just picked?
They just,
She's gonna be singing that the whole drive home.
yes, I did that on purpose. They just try to give you in the first section, like something to bring it home, like or just a real person or a real incident that took place instead of it just being this like out there thing. And so they focused on that guy because he volunteered, he didn't have to be drafted, he ended up pretty much fighting through the whole thing, did get wounded, but fought most of the battles, but survived, whereas 112,000 of them didn't, and then was able to come home and actually marry his sweetheart, like the beautiful American story.
Happily ever after.
Yeah, instead of coming home and his sweetheart is shacking up with, his best friend or something like that.
Well, I highly recommend everyone watch the movie Sergeant York.
Stop that.
It's about World War
Number 25.
It shows the trenches too.
Yeah, that's, who starred in that?
Gary Cooper.
Gary Cooper, that's right.
Such a good movie.
To stiffen the will to win, mass propaganda was used for the first time.
This propaganda they told us about them killing women and children and one thing and another. They had a lot of propaganda about that there. The Hun, you know, they called him. And how he'd go through these villages when he'd capture them and kill all the people off and that there. That's the stuff that they told us. To feed you up to get you mad, I guess.
Atrocities alleged to have been committed by the Germans in Belgium were presented in melodramatic form.
Wir waren wütend über diese Diffamierung.
We were furious about this
Wir haben
slander.
sie immer als bösartige.
We always said that it was evil propaganda, and we felt that we Germans were powerless to answer
in
back.
entsprechender Form antworten konnten.
I just like that beginning of that where it shows the evil Hun.
When people think of the First World War, one of the very first images that comes to mind is of soldiers in the filthy, muddy trenches, fighting, smoking, or just being miserable. So today, here's a special episode of our show about the war in the trenches. I'm Indy Neidell. Welcome to the Great War. The First World War began and ended with a great deal of movement and huge offensives. However, it remains typified by its lack of movement and the years of stalemate on the Western Front, and the trenches were the front lines. But behind them were a massive supply lines, training establishments, storage, workshops, headquarters, and all the other essentials of war where the majority of troops were employed. The idea of digging into the ground for protection was not a new idea or unique to the Great War. It was, for example, widespread in the U.S. Civil War and the Russo-Japanese War. Trench warfare in World War I began in September 1914, just after the Battle of the Marne, north of Paris. The Germans pulled back to the Aisne River and dug into their positions. The British and the French followed suit. What we saw over the following 2 months is known as the Race to the Sea, as trench lines grew and grew northward toward the Channel and the North Sea, and each side tried to outflank the other to gain an advantage. By the end of November, there was a continuous line of trenches between Switzerland and the North Sea. At first, the trenches were little more than foxholes or ditches, intended for short battles. As the stalemate continued, however, it became obvious that a more elaborate system was needed. Now, although the specific construction of a trench was determined by the local terrain, most were built according to the same basic design. The front wall of the trench, the parapet, averaged around 10 feet high. It was lined with sandbags from top to bottom and also had 2 or 3 more feet of sandbags stacked above ground level. In parts of Italy, trenches were dug in rock, in Palestine in sand. In France, the trenches ran through towns and villages, industrial works, coal mines, brickyards, across railway tracks, through farms, fields, and woods, across rivers, canals, and streams, and each feature presented its own set of challenges for the men who had to dig in and defend. The front line of a trench facing the enemy was called the main fire trench. It's not a straight line, and it's dug in sections, so if an artillery shell explodes in one section, or bay, only that section is affected. Behind that is another line called a support line. Now here you find dugouts cut into the side of the trench wall, often very small, but with room for maybe 3 or 4 men to squeeze in for shelter, or for a telephone position. Communications trenches linked the rear areas with the forward lines, and it was along these that all men, equipment, and supplies were transported. Probing out from the front line were further trenches called saps, which often went beyond the protective belts of barbed wire and terminated somewhere in no man's land in a listening post manned by 1 or maybe 2 infantrymen. Now the distance between enemy trenches varied from as little as 30 to several hundred meters, and if you captured an enemy trench, you had a new problem: how to turn it around, as you now needed a protected front in what had been the enemy's unprotected rear. See? Soldiers were regularly rotated through a basic trench cycle, fighting in the front line, followed by time in the support lines, then being in reserve, then a rest period. And the daily trench routine was something like this. An hour before dawn, those that were sleeping were woken to stand to. Everyone fixed bayonets and readied himself to guard against a dawn raid by the enemy. Both sides carried out their respective stand-tos, and despite the knowledge that each side was prepared, it was still at this time that many attacks were carried out. As the light grew, this daily ritual was accompanied by the morning hate. This was when both sides relieved the tension of the early hours with indiscriminate machine gun fire and heavy artillery shelling. Following stand 2, the men would have their breakfast and clean their weapons. The cleaning would be done in shifts though, with only a few of the men cleaning their weapons at any one time. Then came the daily inspection. Weapons would be checked, as would the men's clothing. This inspection would include a foot inspection for signs of trench foot. Now, trench foot was a medical condition peculiar to trench life. It was a fungal infection of the feet caused by cold, wet, and unsanitary trench conditions, and could turn gangrenous and result in amputation. Some 20,000 casualties from trench foot are said to have been suffered by the British Army by the end of 1914, although as trench conditions improved in 1915, it rapidly faded. Daily chores were then assigned. These could be filling the sandbags, repairing duckboards, pumping out the water that had gathered, digging latrines, and so forth. This was followed along the lines by the daily boredom. Movement was restricted in the trenches to what was essential, so when men were not engaged in a specific chore, they settled down to time-killing activities, reading, writing letters, maybe grabbing whatever sleep they could. In the middle of war, the boredom was often crushing. With the dusk came another round of standing to, exactly the same procedure as at dawn. And with the onset of darkness, the men would be ordered to stand down, and the night's work of resupply, maintenance, and sentry duty would begin. Now, sentry duty was never more than 2 hours, as there was a real chance that a man would fall asleep at his post, and falling asleep on duty was considered to be such a serious offense that the penalty was death by firing squad. Nighttime also brought the need to patrol no man's land, man listening posts, and send out wiring parties. Occasionally, a patrol would meet an enemy patrol in the darkness, and they would each be faced with the decision of whether to fight or simply let the other pass. Such fighting, though, would be hand-to-hand, as gunfire would invite a burst from trench machine guns. It has been estimated that up to 1/3 of all Allied casualties on the Western Front were actually sustained in the trenches. To the men serving in them, death was a constant companion, even when it was quiet, and death came in many guises. In busy sectors, the constant shell fire brought random death. Many shelling casualties were buried alive, and those who couldn't be dug out suffered a terrible death indeed. All soldiers in the trenches also quickly learned to curb their natural inclination to peer over the parapet into no man's land. To do so was to invite a sniper's bullet. Disease also took a heavy toll in the trenches, as you may imagine, but no overview of life in the trench would be complete without mentioning the one overriding feature that instantly struck anyone visiting the lines: the appalling smell, which came from several sources, including rotting flesh. The dead could number in the thousands or even tens of thousands. It was often impossible to bury the dead immediately following a battle, and they would lie out in no man's land for days before they could be dealt with. In addition, many died in shell holes that filled up with water, or bodies simply sank into the mud. The stench of rotting flesh was a constant in life in the trenches. Overflowing latrines. The men would try and fill these in and dig new ones, but soon there was no room to dig new ones. Imagine how this was after 4 years. The stench of humanity. Men who had not been afforded the luxury of a bath in weeks or even months would, of course, smell. There was also the smell of disinfectant used to fight disease and infection, and the smells of battle, cordite, or the lingering hint of poison gas. The men on the lines actually grew used to this olfactory overload, but it would overcome first-time visitors to the front. There were also millions and millions of rats. If you're wondering what the men ate, food for soldiers in the trenches during World War I was at times a luxury. Getting hot food from the field kitchens to the front-line trenches could be impossible when a battle was imminent or in progress. Now, at the beginning of the war, soldiers got just over a pound of meat each, the same in bread, and a half pound of vegetables each day. But by 1917, the official ration was much smaller. Fresh meat was getting harder to come by, and the ration was reduced to just 6 ounces of bully beef. Common foods were makanaki stew and hard biscuits. All men received the same rations, and the ranks were always fed before the officers, although when able, the horses ate before both. There was no official vegetarian option, although provision was made for Indian personnel. There was very little waste, and leftovers were sold as swill to local farmers, while drippings were saved for use in manufacturing explosives. The key to success in the trenches was communication, and the mainstay in communications was the runner, who braved bullets and shells, mud and mayhem to take messages to and from forward positions. Although telephones were relatively commonplace, they relied on wires that were easily cut by shell fire or by accident. A big use for the telephone was from forward observation posts to spot for the artillery, and it was not a happy soldier who was told, in the face of shell fire and rifle bullets, to go out and trace and repair breaks in the telephone wires. It was vital, though, for without instant communication, a commander was in an impossible position. Radio was still a fairly new medium, but the wireless advantage was obvious, and it developed rapidly throughout the war, becoming quite sophisticated and common in the trenches by the end. Mud, rats, bad food, disease, dead bodies, unbearable smells, artillery shells, machine guns, no man's land, trench foot, and boredom. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what life in the trenches was like. I don't know about you, but I find it hard to imagine anything worse than the filth, the smell, and the depression of the trenches, with the constant threat of sudden death, and the psychological effect on the soldiers of the war was catastrophic. There is a romantic notion of war, but you won't find it here. The darkness crumbles away. It is the same old druid time as ever. Only a live thing leaps my hand, a queer sardonic rat, as I pull the parapet's poppy to stick behind my ear. Droll rat. They would shoot you if they knew your cosmopolitan sympathies. Now you have touched this English hand, you will do the same to a German soon, no doubt, if it be your pleasure to cross the sleeping green between. It seems you inwardly grin as you pass. Strong eyes, fine limbs, haughty athletes, less chance than you for life, bonds to the whims of murder, sprawled in the bowels of the earth, the torn fields of France. What do you see in our eyes? At the shrieking iron and flame hurled through still heavens, what quaver, what heart aghast? Poppies, whose roots are in man's veins, drop and are ever dropping, but mine in my ear is safe, just a little white with the dust. If you'd like to know more about when trench warfare began in the Great War, check out these episodes about the Battle of the Aisne. And if you'd like to cook the makanaki stew yourself, check out our video of the recipe right here or in the info box below. And let us...
What basically is trench foot?
What?
What basically is trench foot? Like, what happened?
You're in your boots for so long, and it's people don't take their boots off, and it's moist, and they
Like fungus or whatever.
and all of that kind of stuff. And people, when they saw that other people take their boots off, they refused to like come to the realization that that was happening to their feet too. So it would just get worse and worse, and to the point where they couldn't even take their boots off. They had to cut their feet off with the boots still on.
Yeah, it was pretty horrible. But as I said, you know, it was worse in the first year, and then they started to kind of understand what was causing it, and then instead of allowing water to gather in the bottom of the trench, they started to build up the base of the trench with sandbags so that you weren't standing on the bottom of it, and so they kept their feet. Plus, they started supplying them with lots more socks, so they could change their socks every day if they were able to get them to them. So, you know how they mentioned the thing about the runner being the person that would have to take messages because a lot of times the phone lines would break? Well, this next clip I'm going to show you comes from that movie Gallipoli, where Mel Gibson and his buddy join up with the Australian troops together. Now Mel Gibson really had no desire to be in the war, whereas his buddy saw this as his sacred duty to go and fight for his country and to do this. And he and Mel Gibson become friends because they're both runners. They actually go to different races and compete against each other and stuff. And so he talks Mel Gibson into going with him and joining up. And because of their speed, they both start out as runners. So it's their job to run the messages back and forth. But his friend wants to fight. Mel Gibson doesn't want to fight. He doesn't want to shoot at anybody and doesn't want to get shot at. But his friend always wanted to fight. And so eventually they let him join the infantry and start fighting, but Mel Gibson becomes kind of the main runner for this particular regiment. And this is at the Battle of Gallipoli, and supposedly Mel Gibson is the guy who's got to get a message to the front lines because they've lost communication because the phone lines have been cut. So that's kind of the setting the stage. This is toward the end of the movie, if you were going to watch the movie itself.
Jim Gardner, go of the week.
Listen for GHQ! Listen for GHQ! Urgent message GHQ!
It does sound pointless to go on. On the other hand...
Excuse me, sir. British are ashore at Suvla.
Are they meeting heavy opposition?
None, sir. Apparently they've called a halt and the officers are sitting on the beach drinking cups of tea.
Tell Major Barton the attack is... No, just tell him that I'm reconsidering the whole situation. Sir.
What's happening here is that this is supposed to be a major offensive, and the troops are in the trenches, and then there was supposed to be this huge artillery barrage to kind of soften up the enemy, and then the guys in the trenches are going to be told to attack, and they're supposed to come up out of the trench and start running for the other side. Well, something's gone wrong, and there hasn't been this artillery barrage to soften up the other side. But the guys that are in the trenches, the commanders there, aren't getting any information as to what they're supposed to do. And they're supposed to send them out of the trench at a certain time, and that was the commander saying, I'm reconsidering, because he's trying to figure out what's happening everywhere else, and should I still be doing this, because if I do this, and there's been no artillery barrage, and the enemy hasn't been kind of, softened up and, kind of distracted, I'm going to just be sending my men out there to die. So he's trying to figure out if, he really should go forward with this. But because the telephone lines are down, it takes Mel Gibson running back and forth, trying to get messages from one guy to the other to figure out what he's supposed to be doing. All right?
Okay.
And these are the guys in the trench that are waiting to come up and start racing across them.
not going to make us go, are they?
No, there's no point.
Those men should have gone, Barton. Marker flags have been seen.
Not by me, sir. I've asked for confirmation from General Gardner.
The orders are to attack, and you'll do so immediately. The British at Suvla must be allowed to get ashore. Is that clear? You are to push on.
It's cold-blooded murder.
I said push on.
Can't ask the men to do what I wouldn't do myself. All right, men. We're going. I want you all to remember who you are. You're the 10th Light Horse. Men from Western Australia. Don't forget it. Good luck. Thanks, Phyllis. You too.
Your legs. Springs. Steel springs. What are they gonna do? They're gonna hurl me down the track. How fast can you run? Fast as a leopard. How fast are you gonna run? As fast as a leopard. And let's see you do it. Gateway! 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 Urgent amendment! Gateway!
I don't have the statistics in front of me, but the Battle of Gallipoli was, extremely costly, especially for the Australian troops there. And, part of it, I mean, they're showing you the part where there was miscommunication and people were sent over the top, into just basically suicide. If you look at the whole battle, eventually the Australians ended up being successful, but that particular part of it was not good. But it really, I think, it's obviously it's a Hollywood movie, but it does kind of give you that understanding of how pointless much of the trench warfare was. And I think if airplanes had been more common and we had, there was more ability to drop bombs and things like that, like we had in World War II, trench warfare wouldn't have worked in World War II, because you just fly overhead and bomb all the trenches, right? But they didn't have the ability to do that. There were planes, but not nearly like there were in World War II. So that's why you don't see the same kind of warfare in World War II. It's fought very differently because of planes and tanks and everything else. But it's a good movie. And it does kind of give you that, you know, how the guy was talking about the different lines of the trenches, you know, the support lines, and then the front lines, you know, so that you get a sense that it's almost like a whole system. It isn't just one big trench where the guys are fighting. There were several different trenches plus these communication trenches that connected them. It gives you a little bit of that sense in that particular clip there. This is the famous movie that was made in 1930, so it wasn't that long after World War I, and it's pretty early cinematography, and it's told from the perspective of a German soldier that joins up because all the Germans, you know, were being told, just like Americans, you got to do this for your country, fight for your fatherland, you know, protect your culture and all of those kinds of things. And he, you know, joins up, but the movie goes on to show the change in him from, you know, going as this patriotic person to then becoming to realize that it's real easy to talk about that when you're back home. And you know, he had a teacher that encouraged all the boys to go fight and to be heroes and all this kind of stuff. And you know, he gets out there and he's killing other young men just like himself, and he doesn't really understand why. So you know, this is another like a charge, just like the one that those guys were being asked to do, a scene from that part of So you're gonna get shot one way or
I
another.
feel like that's a dumb order. I'm just gonna blindly run across this field. May not make it to the
I
other
feel
side.
like that's a double standard.
And get
I agree with you.
Wouldn't it just be smarter to go ahead and like attempt to
What if my
dig
commander
underneath
was
no man's land?
not thinking properly?
What's that?
You'd think that they would more of like an attempt to like dig underneath no man's land to like.
Like a tunnel?
Yeah, and to be honest, they probably did. I don't know enough about that, but, I mean, tunneling was definitely something that
Pretty
people
much with the artillery
attempted in
fire.
that time period. But, I mean, this was seriously almost 3 years of, like, stalemate like this. Often them just sitting in the trenches doing nothing because they knew how insane it was to try to take the other trench.
I'll be the cook.
There's one story about on the Western Front at Christmas time one year. The troops actually came out of the trenches, met in the middle, and celebrated Christmas together.
I think I heard that.
And then said, good luck, and went back to their trench and started fighting again the next day.
But weren't they ordered to not? They were ordered to move because one of the generals didn't like the idea of them. Like they didn't like the idea. Okay, yesterday they were all just friendly and stuff. But it kind of.
Yeah, well, I mean, definitely some of the generals were not comfortable with it because they knew that it would make it harder for these guys to shoot those people in the future. It's like you just made friends with them. Now you're going to have to, look them in the eye and shoot them.
That was like the one part of the war that was just like you saw people where there was still some humane.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, the year after that, they tried to do it again on the German side. They came up out of the trenches, but the British were told not to come out, and they just shot them. That's why the Christmas Day massacre was the year after.
All right, this is an actual photo of people in the trenches. I'll pull it up in a second. Just read that first. War is being fought from trenches with soldiers at machine guns guarding land made barren by artillery barrages, throwing hand grenades at the often unseen enemy and using poison gas. Hopefully we'll be able to see the gas mask. It's difficult to find in such a scene a sense of a progressive civilization, of the dignity of the individual, or of reasoned interaction among nations, the ideals held by 19th century Western civilization. Remember, we just finished talking about last week the progressive era, how we're supposed to be these intelligent, evolved people that are always making civilization better. And then you see 4 years of this kind of warfare, Considering the use of such weapons, we can easily imagine the carnage and the sense of futility that resulted from the heroic offensive charges of the foot soldiers that were so common for most of this war. This is not real easy to see. This is an old, it's actually a transparency. But, just think if you're stuck in that for weeks. That's where you live for weeks, in the mud, the cold, or the heat, depending on what time of year it is. The rats, that one film talked a little bit about the rats, but there's some other stuff that I've read that's just horrendous.
They started eating the rats. That's what they ate.
Well, and the rats ate them. If people died and you couldn't get their bodies out of the trench because you were going to get hit.
Don't they pick up the dead at nighttime?
They would attempt to.
They didn't have.
Like a white flag or something on?
Yeah, but sometimes as many people as were dead, trying to get them all moved, and especially if you're trying to properly bury them. Okay, this is also from the Battle of Verdun in 1916. This is by a French army officer, 1916. I'll let you read for yourselves. Can you guys see that? Or is it too small? what it says here? By sacrificing thousands of men after formidable bombardment, an enemy trench can always be taken.
Thousands, not even hundreds. Oh,
At this, the third German wave uses the dead of the second wave as ramparts and shelters.
They got people to sacrifice.
nice.
And that's one reason I've never signed up for that.
There are slopes on Hill 304 where the level of the ground is raised several meters by mounds of German corpses.
We make prisoners when they're dead during attacks. So when the artillery fire goes off, some people get knocked out, they just take them as prisoners?
It says they're for the most part dazed with fear and alcohol, so they allow them to drink.
Alcohol, I don't remember the statistics, but each man was, the ration of alcohol was significantly high for what we would think today. I guess they realized that without that,
They couldn't do that.
they wouldn't be
Yeah.
able to do what they had to do. Now, that changed as the war went on because they ran out of, the grain and everything to make the alcohol, but in the beginning, the daily ration was like, I don't remember what it was, but I remember it shocking me that it could be that much per man.
This was the
Wow.
sober.
Dr. Dunn, is anybody here was in the Army before? I guess I'm the only one. Well, I'll explain to you. When we're in basic training, they train us to not think, just act. And by the time I was done with basic training, I was so eager to go to the Middle East and fight. Now I think back and I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe that I was thinking like that. But that's how the Army, they want you to just be
Numb to that kind of stuff.
right. And then there's actually a movie about the World War I where Russia would stand with machine guns and shoot any of their soldiers that would try to run back or not go forward.
Yeah, I believe that.
So it's either you go and do what you were supposed to do, or you would get killed. So you have a better chance of surviving if you go over and fight and do what you gotta do.
And then you're not labeled a coward too, so.
So it's a, in the military, we don't question, we just do. And then that's how they train us, and that's how they, that's what they want us to do.
So you need to, they're changing your mindset from you
I think
just.
that people only think
If you question
about
them, they
to
assume
kill
it's treason.
because they can feel,
Everything is
they
treason
feel
when you
scared
think
to
about
be
it.
killed.
Yeah. Now, this is a poem that was written by this person who was actually killed in action in 1918, 1 week before the armistice. So let me pull this up so you can see the lines of the poem. And there's more to it that I need to pull over to the other page. So this is talking about a gas attack where they have to get their gas mask on quickly. Can I go to the next part? for one's own country. That's what this is saying. So he's basically saying, if you could see what I've seen, you wouldn't go around telling your children that it's glorious to go and die for your country. Anyway, these, if you read more of these stories of people that fought in the trenches in World War I and really saw, there's one thing that I don't know why I don't have it here, but that I've shared with my students in the past that talks about, like I said before, about the rats, but it talks about how this one person woke up to a corpse that was in the trench with him. But at first he didn't understand what he was seeing because he's looking at this corpse, but it was like, there was like this hole in his head. And then he realized that the next thing he saw was like a rat stick its head out. So
eating his brain.
Yeah, so the rat had like somehow gotten, it had eaten out the eyes completely. The guy says something about how that's what they go for first. It's like a delicacy for the rat, is they go for the eyes. Anyway, I can't stand rats anyway. I can't imagine having to live in a trench when, and they talk about these rats being huge. Like seriously, not like rats like we think of today, but like
These people are getting
big
fat on,
things.
plenty of food.
You can imagine they ate the rats? Oh, hell no.
I guess if you got hungry enough, you'd eat it, but
I'll eat my own finger first.
you seem to have studied some of this stuff of World War I. Got anything to add to that?
Oh no, I've taken an interest in both World Wars.
Well, if you have anything to add, feel free, because you probably know more than I do. It's not something I've studied tremendously, but anyway, on the home front, obviously, we have to do things here to make sure our soldiers have what they need overseas. And so there were a lot of things that we had to do to organize our resources. And so many different agencies were created to try to make sure that the resources here were being put to the best use. The War Industries Board tried to make sure everything in reference to industry was, war first, and then consumer goods comes after that. The Food Administration, again, making sure we have food for us, but also making sure that we can have as much food as possible to send overseas. Railroad, again, putting the war first. You got to make sure that transportation of troops and supplies for the war comes before anything else does. Fuel Administration, coal was one of our main sources of fuel, and needing to be sure that war's priority. So all of these things were set up during the war, and for the most part, we did a pretty good job of all of these things. Not perfect, not totally efficient, but generally speaking, we did a pretty good job during World War I in terms of organizing our resources and getting the American people to be supportive of this instead of always complaining about what was going on. Americans bought war bonds, which we called Liberty bonds. Again, it's kind of propaganda. You support this by buying war bonds, and it's going to help preserve your liberty. We also had more of an income tax to bring in money. $23 billion raised through the sale of Liberty bonds. So very, supportive of that. Also, a lot more jobs were created because of the war, and at higher wages because people are in demand, and many of our young soldiers, they go overseas, so they're not here working any longer. So a lot of good things seem to be happening in labor, but most of that's going to disappear as soon as the war is over with. So labor starts to feel like they're being recognized, they're getting paid a decent wage, they've got decent hours, and then it all kind of evaporates as soon as the war comes to an end, and that's going to cause some issues. We talked before about the pressure to pass prohibition, which the war helped that because the grain could then be used for food instead of for alcohol, and then also women, this kind of gave them the opportunity to really push for the right to vote because a lot more responsibility fell on women as the men went overseas. And so both of those things were passed you know, the movement was there, they were passed in 1919, became effective in 1920, but by the time they both came effective, the war was over with anyway. But it's done, so they don't take it back. So prohibition is going to then stay in place for 13 years. Wilson tried to sell this as, you know, the fact that we were entering the world because we were going to, in essence, save the world. We're going to make the world safe for democracy. That was his line. And he believed it. I mean, I don't think this was just him blowing smoke. I think he honestly believed that we had the responsibility to fight this war, bring it to a peaceful end, and then kind of set up a whole new world order to where the world would then be safer and more cooperative. It didn't quite work out that way.
How about a country that wasn't involved? That would make much more sense. Like, just
Yeah, true. Except it's kind of funny because he's trying to make the world safe for democracy while he's basically curtailing civil rights in America. The Committee on Public Information was formed to create a lot of propaganda about the war to really convince people that we were in the right, and by going over to kill the evil Hun, we were going to make the world better. But in doing some of these things, anybody who spoke out against the war was considered a traitor, and many people were imprisoned or deported because they honestly did not think that the war was the right thing for us to do. So it's funny that we're making the world safe for democracy, but we're not letting people exercise their civil rights here at home.
Yeah.
It's also the first time that we started teaching Western civilization. Most students don't realize that. They just assume they were taught from the very beginning. But we didn't start teaching Western civilization until 1917. And the purpose of Western civilization classes in college was to
teach people about the evils of Germany.
well, that, but also to convince people of their connection to Britain and France so that you would feel the need to protect them and be willing to go serve. So it was, in essence, propaganda. Western civilization courses were started as propaganda to convince young Americans, especially young men, to go fight overseas. Like I said, Espionage Act was passed, Sedition Act was passed. All of these things were directed at anybody who was speaking out against the war or in any way challenging the war. So, kind of a contradictory thing that we did that at the same time that we were supposedly trying to introduce democracy to everybody else. Now, as the war started to come to an end, Wilson came up with what he called the 14 points, and this was going to be his new world order, how we were going to make the world a better place. And those 14 points argued for liberal democratic principles like freedom of the seas, removal of trade barriers, recognizing the rights of colonized people, and that's when we started to push for the idea that we shouldn't have colonies, that people had the right to be independent, supported the right of self-determination of those lands. And the main thing that Wilson really wanted to see, his last point of the 14 points, was a League of Nations. He believed if we could create a League of Nations, it could become an objective arbiter of international affairs and international conflicts, and we would no longer have these incidents of world war. That everybody would be willing to come to this League of Nations and share their points of view, and then the objective, mediator would say, okay, well, this is what we're going to do, and everybody would agree to that. Life would be good, right? And it was so important to him. If he could get that one thing, I think he believed that everything else would sort of fall into place. But he gets over there, and he went himself, which was a huge mistake. But Wilson went over there himself to be the representative from the United States. Now, he took some people with him, but he took all Democrats with him, no Republicans. So he pissed off the whole Republican Party by doing that. So he goes over there and he presents his 14 points, and I think he literally thought that everybody would just fall on the ground and worship him or something. Like, they would be like, oh my God, you are so wise. Why did we not listen to you before? And just do exactly what you want us to do. Now the people, the regular people of Europe were very happy because they felt like the U.S. really had saved them. So they kind of treated him like a hero. But the leaders over there did not want anything to do, and he wanted to be really lenient toward Germany. Just kind of like, you know, that was bad, don't do that again. Let's all be friends now, and, you know. And everybody else wanted to just cream Germany. You know, they wanted vengeance. And he had a hard time convincing them, and so he had to compromise on almost every one of his points, but the one thing he got was a League of Nations. I mean, that was his main thing, and so he compromised on the other stuff to be able to get the League of Nations. But in the process, he had to agree to Article 231 of the treaty. Which is this one. The Allied and associated governments affirm and Germany accepts the responsibility of Germany and her allies for causing all the loss and damage to which the Allied and associated governments and their nationals have been subjected as a consequence of the war imposed upon them by the aggression of Germany and her allies.
Wow.
It's called the War Guilt Clause. And basically, Germany and their allies had to accept complete responsibility for everything to do with the war.
But they only
Even though
mentioned
the-
Germany.
Even though Germany didn't even start the war.
Yeah, but by this point, Germany is definitely the leader in the war. They have come out as being I mean, Austria-Hungary is kind of following them, and they're the more militaristic country. So by the time we get to this point, Germany is considered to be the one that has made this all happen and continue to happen. William?
Okay, that answers my question.
Okay.
Yep.
So this is called the War Guilt Clause. This is not what Wilson wanted. He knew that by doing this, it was going to just make Germany really angry and resentful and just put them in a position where they would want vengeance, you know, in the future, which we all know happened. Plus, they were assigned $33 billion that they had to pay back because of what happened.
When did they pay that off? Or they still
But they never did pay it all off. They ended up just paying for a little while and then saying, we just don't have the money, we're not going to do it anymore. And then there came a point where it was just kind of like written off and said, okay, it's not going to
There
happen.
was something that was paid off recently, like a year or two ago, having to do with World War I. I forgot what it was. Oh my gosh, we were talking about it in August.
I'm not sure. I'm not going to have you go through all of this, but this is what the 14 points looked like. And the first one here talks about his concern had to do with all of these like secret treaties that different countries had with each other, you know, kind of creating this balance, supposedly this balance of power. So he's talking about open covenants of peace, openly arrived at. Absolute freedom of navigation upon the seas, you know, so that you can't claim a certain part of the, you know, the world as your own kind of thing. Removal of economic barriers.
Except that's exactly what we did.
What we did, yes. It's okay for us to do it, Stephen. I mean, you know, what's wrong? Interesting that this is in here, because he's calling for, even back during World War I, for every country to reduce the amount of armaments, you know, like warships, guns, you know, planes, everything, so that, you know, nobody can just
defend themselves.
Well, defend yourself is one thing, but to have like a superiority in that to where you could crush other nations, you know, which is, you know, we struggle with this to this day, you know, trying to make sure that there isn't any other country in the world that is building up their armaments in any form. Free, open-minded, absolute, impartial adjustment of all colonial claims. This is where we get into problems, because after this war ended, we divided up territory kind of arbitrarily. And in doing that, we created some of the current situations that we deal with today in the Mideast, and in Europe. I mean, we've kind of dealt with it over the years. I mean, World War II was part of what happened with this kind of dividing up of territory. I'm not not gonna go through all of the rest of this. A lot of this talks about what's gonna happen to individual countries like Belgium, readjustment of the borders of Italy, those kinds of things. But the very last one, as I said, is the 14th point, where he talks about a general association of nations that must be formed for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. So he gets them to accept a League of Nations, but what ends up happening is that here at home, when he comes back, because every nation, I mean, you can agree to this, treaty in principle, but when you come back to your own nation, your government has to vote on that treaty and agree to it, to ratify it. And Wilson convinces them of several things and gets them to agree to a League of Nations, and then comes home and presents it to Congress to be ratified, and all of a sudden, nobody's happy. And Congress began to say, well, we don't like what you agreed to here and here and here. And many people didn't like the idea of the League of Nations because they felt like it put too much responsibility on us to kind of be the policemen of the world and would entangle us in international affairs that we didn't need to be involved with. So they wanted to offer what they called reservations, or some adjustments to that treaty before they would be willing to support it and ratify it. And Wilson said, no, you accept it as it is or nothing. Again, his arrogance, and it had to be his way. And to make a long story short, well, first he goes on this tour of the United States to try to convince the American people that he's done this great thing and that they should put pressure on their congressmen to approve it. And in the process, he collapses and has a stroke. And he's literally paralyzed and out of commission for many months, in which the vice president should have taken over as president and didn't. His wife basically ran the country. So we've already had a female president. We just don't know about it. Because she would not let anybody in to see her husband. People would bring her questions and concerns, and she would go into a room that he was in bed and supposedly talk to him and come back out and tell them the answer. And they don't even know if he was conscious.
Yeah.
So she was basically running the country.
Not enough people know about this.
Well, they do now. Well, anyway, we never ratified the treaty. As far as we're concerned, World War I is still going on.
Wow.
We've never ratified it to end the treaty. So, can you imagine if you're the guy who gets them to agree to a treaty, and you can't even get your own country to ratify it and to sign off on it?
That's embarrassing.
Is what he wanted to do, is it something like the United Nations kind
Yes.
of sort of?
And we did create a League of Nations. They went ahead and did it. We never joined it. It was never very effective because the nations were not willing to really see it as truly having that kind of power. So eventually, after World War II, we created the United Nations, which at least has more power than the League of Nations ever did. I mean, it's still not as strong as maybe some people would want it to be. Let me just mention this because most people don't know about this either. In 1918, there were two, well, really one epidemic, if you want to talk about a health epidemic. That was the Spanish flu, influenza. If you ever need to do a history project, this is a really fascinating study because 40 million people died in 1918 because of the flu. 700,000 of those were Americans. I mean, we're talking a major epidemic that swept the world, and whole cities and towns were wiped out because of the flu. So when people talk about getting the flu today, we tend to just think it's this, annoying thing that we have to put up with for a few days. I mean, it can be really serious. Even in this day and age, people still die from the flu. But it's a really interesting study. The other thing that your book refers to as an epidemic is what happened in Russia. Because the reason why Russia pulled out of the war was what? I know this was one of your questions. Who had that one? part of it.
They're up where it's like really cold, wasn't it? Getting around winter time, they're having trouble shipping over supplies and stuff like
Yeah,
that.
all of the stuff having to do with resources, and they'd lost lots and lots of people. I mean, the war was deadly for
They weren't going
Russians.
anywhere. Didn't they want to take part in Germany as well? Like they were trying to expand Russia.
But what was the major event in Russia that kind of,
The revolution that they had.
yeah, there had been the Russian Revolution that had taken place in 1917, and the government that had been in power for 300 years, the Romanov government, the Romanov dynasty that had been in power for 300 years, the Tsar of Russia, is toppled, and this group of people called the Bolsheviks take over Russia, which we now think of as communism, and they decided that the wealthy elite of Russia had been using all of the regular people of Russia to fight these wars and sending them out into battle sometimes without boots, without guns, expecting them to die for their country, while they're literally starving to death, and the Russian elite are living in luxury and being pampered and everything else. And so the Bolsheviks come to power and convince the people that you don't need to be their tools anymore, their pawns anymore. We don't have to fight this war. And they go to Germany and just pull out. They just say, look, we're just willing to stop fighting. And Germany agreed to that because they needed to, concentrate on the Western Front. So, yes, it was lack of funds and resources and all of this kind of stuff, but it wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for the Bolshevik Revolution. And this is when communism comes into existence, really. I mean, you didn't have communism before Lenin. Lenin is the guy who brings communism to the world. Now, Marx kind of came up with the idea, but Lenin is the one who actually puts it into place. And so Russia, from this point forward, till some point, it's like, do you say 1989, or are they really still, it's kind of hard to say. I don't know what's going on in Russia today. It's, still a mess. But until 1989, they would have been considered a communist state. 1917 to 1989. But if this had not happened in 1917, I don't think Russia would have pulled out of the war. Whether they should have or shouldn't have, they wouldn't. It would have been considered cowardly to do that, and the Tsar would never have done that. But Lenin comes to power, and he pulls Russia out, and puts, obviously, Britain and France in a very precarious situation, which is then why we almost felt like we had to get involved, because
Trying to remember
what choice they had.
Trying to remember the name of that movie, that Russian movie that I was talking about.
Nicholas and Alexandra.
What is it?
Nicholas and Alexandra.
Yeah, they actually showed how they gave one rifle to two people, and you're like, what?
And they were often instructed that, just go out, and then, when people start dying, you just pick up their guns and you'll have a gun.
Yes.
You don't need to have one yourself, because eventually, somebody will die and you can just pick up theirs.
And take their shoes and stuff. We would do that with shoes. Well, everybody, because being in the trenches, you want new shoes.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that was during the time also that Alexandra was listening to Rasputin.
Right.
The crazy dude.
They did the same thing.
Really crazy dude.
They did the same thing in World War II for the Battle of Stalingrad. What they did is they gave one guy a rifle, another guy a magazine, so whenever he got killed, you just pick up his rifle and continue on.
Yep. Speaking of Russia, one last thing. The Red Scare, that was another one of your questions. When we talk about the Red Scare, what we're really referring to is the Bolshevik flag was red. And the Red Scare refers to the fear that the U.S. had that communism was going to infiltrate the U.S. And we had two different Red Scares in our country. One happened right after World War I because the Bolshevik Revolution had just happened, and we saw Russia just change overnight, to this new communist government. And then obviously after World War II, when the Soviet Union had, gained so much power and was basically our kind of,
Arch enemy.
At least as powerful as us, and our fear was they were going to become our arch enemy, which they did become. So then we became scared that again communism was infiltrating America. So there were two major Red Scares in the country. One was right after World War I, and one was right after World War II. All Alright, there's some other clips that are posted on the website that are pretty interesting regarding the war, so if you have time and you feel like watching those, they're on there. I mean, obviously there's tons of stuff on YouTube about World War I, but it's a fascinating and disheartening war, but obviously huge ramifications for our country as well as the rest of the world. If you have your homework, make sure you leave it, why don't you just leave it on this front table as you walk out where Kelly's sitting.